Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for making it out tonight. Our topic is the first in a three-part series on Israel, which all follow on from last week's topic of will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And I'd highly recommend going back and watching that one, as it was a very interesting summary of the last 80 or so years of conflict in the Middle East region and how the Bible promises that that will be resolved. Tonight, however, we're just looking at history. We'll be mostly covering events from around the 18th century BC to the 1st century AD. Most of the history of Israel, or the Jewish people, has been pretty much the same since then till about the 1800s, when things started to change from a little bit and then on into the 1900s. But I don't want to steal any content from next week's speaker, so we'll leave most of that alone, as that topic will be Israel's present. And obviously we won't go in much for Israel's future, because that's the third talk in this series. But we will touch briefly on both of these, just so that we can set the stage for sort of the culmination of this whole story, this whole series, so that we can really see that Israel is a nation chosen by God. And Israel is a fascinating place, just from a geography point of view. Over the millennia, it has had many names and peoples that make claim to it. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all claim the land as holy, with many holy sites in contention, most of it centred around Jerusalem. Names for the land, or parts of it, include Israel, Palestine, Judea, Galilee, the Holy Land, Canaan, the ancient Canaanites, Jewish people, Assyrians, the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, various Muslim caliphates, the Ottomans, the British. They've all laid claim to this land at some point or other, often vying for control over the centuries as it changed hands. So it's little wonder that it has such a storied and complex past. And I'd just like to take this moment right now to state that by putting on these talks, we aren't making a stand for Israel, we're not making a stand for any other side, we're not making a stand at all on that front. As Christadelphians, we don't vote, we don't participate in politics. All sides of the current conflict are being negatively affected, and as the Bible tells us, we should pray for peace and goodwill to all men, and that is something that we stand by. Hopefully you'll be able to see over the course of tonight and the next couple of weeks why we've chosen this topic and why Israel can still be a nation chosen by God, and how that can still be true today regardless of any political, military or otherwise decisions that may be making at the moment. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. Israel's past and how they're a nation chosen by God. There'll be three main focus points for tonight. We'll have the good of Israel's past, the bad of Israel's past, and then the impact of both of those sort of on the nation and ultimately on us, so we can know why the topic is important to us tonight. Because the good and the bad often came very soon after each other or at the same time, often in generational cycles, we won't be splitting them up into extremely defined sections with very clear cuts. But I've done my best to split it sort of thematically and chronologically at the same time, so there's a bit of a timeline jump backward when we need it. So let's start at the very beginning of the history of the nation of Israel. Like all nations, they began as a tribe, and like all tribes, they began as a family. And like all families, they typically start with one man and one woman. Our reading outlined this start of the family, and it talks about the starting man and woman of this tribe. Their names were Abram and Sarai. They lived in a city called which is in Mesopotamia, or southern Iraq. It was a powerful city-state located near the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and at the time was probably a coastal city near the Persian Gulf, although, as you can see, that has changed over the millennia. Now, God spoke to Abram and told him to leave that city of to leave his kindred and to go to a land that God would show him, and that Abram would become a great nation. If people blessed this nation, they too would be blessed. And if they cursed this nation, they too would be cursed. This is the first reference to a nation that God chose, an as yet unnamed nation that would be descendant from Abraham. So he obeyed, and gradually he made his way along the Euphrates and then down into the land of Canaan. Many different peoples lived in the land at that time, collectively known as the Canaanites, because they lived in the land of Canaan. These tribes and peoples were not good. They believed in angry and immoral gods and committed child sacrifice and other practices as part of their worship. This was the land that had been promised to Abram, as God later told him. However, Sarai, his wife, was barren. She couldn't have any children. So that part about him becoming a great nation couldn't happen in their current state. They were old. Sarai herself was barren, so they tried a different method, and Abram was able to have a child with Sarai's handmaid. This child's name was Ishmael, and he eventually grew up to father a nomadic tribe of people called the Ishmaelites. There are a few extra tribes in here that we'll touch on, but I'll cover their importance once we've got to sort of collect all of them. And Lot, Abram's nephew, also had two sons. He had Moab and Ben-Ami, who also became local tribes, the Moabites and the Ammonites. God reaffirmed these promises that he'd made to Abram, and then he changed his name to Abraham, which means a father of many nations. We read of this in Genesis 17, if you just quickly come across there with me. So in Genesis 17, we'll read from verses 1 to 8. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, For me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So Abram is now called Abraham. He will be a father to many nations, not just one. And this covenant made by God would be everlasting. Every generation below Abraham would be held by this covenant. God also makes a specific statement that he would be their God. This is a clarifying clause in this covenant. For it to take effect, the people had to keep God as their God, like Abraham had. And we'll touch more on this idea of the covenant and the connection that it had to obtaining the good things in this promise later on. Continuing on, however, in verse 15, God says, As for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell upon his face, and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, O that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. So we're told here, Ishmael is not of the line that these promises will pass through. This is not the chosen seed that would establish themselves in the land of Canaan. This seed would be through a son called Isaac. Ishmael would be multiplied into a great tribe at the same time as well, but Isaac's line was singled out to be this promised chosen line. And so the next year, Isaac was born, and he grew up, and he eventually had twins named Esau and Jacob. Esau went on to father the tribe of Edom, and along with the sons of Lot and the Ishmaelites, these tribes settled around the land of Canaan, and they were the ancestors to the current Arab nations. And there was just as much animosity between these tribes and the ancient Israelites as there are now. Jacob, the younger twin, was renamed Israel, which means prince with God. He, in turn, had 12 sons, which went on to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Hopefully you can see why we started a couple of generations back with the original promise of this seed. This is the real start to the nation of Israel, with the origins of why they are chosen by God. Abraham was promised this line from him that would become a great nation with God as their God at the very centre of their lives. And through his son and his grandson, that nation started. The Jewish people ever since have revered these three men as their patriarchs, the very beginning of them as a separate people. Now, as the family grew, they eventually settled in Egypt for a time. God had said that the wickedness of the people settled in the land of Canaan was not yet full, meaning that there were still some that could be redeemed. There were still pockets of faithful, good people, so the family of Israel could not yet settle. As they grew in Egypt, they were oppressed and they were enslaved by the pharaohs for decades, until they were led out of the land by a man named Moses. With God's guidance, Moses led the people of Israel through the Red Sea, which parted before them so they could go over on dry land, and crashing back and destroying the Egyptian army that had pursued them. They then travelled to a mountain called Sinai, where God gave Moses the law, the commandments that the nation of Israel were to follow as they travelled and ultimately once they'd settled in the land of Canaan. It took them some time to get to the land, but fast forward a couple of decades and they entered and conquered the land under a man named Joshua, the protege of Moses, but they didn't entirely remove the other nations before them. Because of this, the other nations grew. They came back. And along with outside nations over the next few centuries, they were a constant thorn in the nation of Israel's side. During this period, there were no kings. The nation was not an organised kingdom. They were just a group of loosely connected tribes that sometimes fought amongst themselves. Eventually, they decided they did want a king. And God chose them a man named Saul, who was strong and tall and handsome. Someone that the people would easily be able to look to and see what they thought an ideal king would be like. Saul, unfortunately, was not a very good king. He had his great moments, but he cared very little for God. He didn't put God at the centre of his life, like God said his people and his line would do, caring more about what the people thought of him. The next king, David, was a very different calibre of man. He was described as a man after God's own heart. And he also made mistakes while he was king, but he also always repented. He always learned from his mistakes and he strived to do what was right. He put God first, right at the centre. He was like Abraham, his ancestor. He made God his God. And because of this, David's descendants ruled over the kingdom, centred in their home tribe of Judah, and Judah is where the name Jews come from. Unfortunately, David's grandson lost the northern 10 tribes to a rebellion due to poor decision-making, and the united nation of Israel split, with the kingdom of Judah under the Davidic kings in the south and the kingdom of Israel under a series of dynasties in the north. A couple of centuries later, the northern kingdom was overthrown by the Assyrian Empire, and most of them were dispersed throughout the territories of Assyria, although not all were taken. Those that remained were supplemented with other peoples that had also been forcibly removed from their homes and became known as the Samaritans after their capital city, Samaria. And this left Judah as the remaining nation of Jewish people, the remaining line of Abraham, and the remaining chosen nation. They too, however, were conquered around 120 years later by the Babylonians, and they were taken into captivity. They were returned and given some level of autonomy by the Achaemenid Persian Empire some 70 years later, when they themselves were conquered by the Babylonians, or when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. When the Grecians took over, after the Persians, the nation was caught in the middle of the warring Ptolemaic kingdom in the south and the Seleucid Empire in the north. Getting sick of these two kingdoms, barging through their lands and desecrating their holy sites, especially their newly built temple, the Jews threw off their rule and formed their own independent state once again under the rule of the Maccabees, or the Hasmonean dynasty. This also was not to last, as the Roman Republic conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, ending their independence once again. So, for the past 500 years up to this point, the Jewish people in Judah and Jerusalem had been conquered or ruled by at least 4 major nations. And for millennia before that, they had fought with Egypt and Assyria and all the surrounding tribes of Ammon and Moab and Edom. Yet despite this, they'd kept their language, They'd kept their laws, their cities, and their culture. They'd been battered down, but they were never dispersed. They were never integrated forever. They kept their national identity the entire time. And this brings us up to the time of the New Testament. Come with me to the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1. Reading from Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, we're told, "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren." And then it goes on and it lists the entire family tree, from Abraham down the chosen line of Isaac and then Jacob, whose name was Israel, as we've seen, to the royal line of Judah, through David, and then to the adopted father of Jesus, Joseph. And a similar family line is outlined in the book of Luke that goes down the same line but splits from David, from a different son, through to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So either line, the adopted line and the bloodline, they both originate from David, the royal line of the Israelite nation, and obviously from Abraham. Our speaker for the future part of the series will touch more on Jesus and his role as a royal descendant. However, this Jesus was, through Mary, as we've said, of the line of David, of the nation of Israel, but he was also the Son of God. Later, in Matthew 1, verses 21, we read, "And she, being Mary, shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins." As the Son of God, Jesus was sent to God's chosen people to save them from sin, to bring them back to God, to make sure that God was their God again, and to make him the centre of the Israelite nation's lives. He prophesied and he taught and he healed the sick, and he tried to bring the nation back, to get them to listen and to worship God and love each other properly again, as they had been commanded. But they were stubborn and they refused to listen to him. Jesus spoke many times of the consequences of not listening to God. Luke 21 is probably the most in-depth, so come across with me there. Jesus was nearby Jerusalem at the time that he gave this prophecy, and his disciples were commenting on the temple when he told them in verse 6, "As for these things which ye behold, the day will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." This temple had taken 46 years to build and was basically considered a wonder of the world at the time, the centre of the Jewish worship. So the disciples were amazed at this, and they asked when this would happen. Jesus goes on to warn them to not be deceived. This would happen, and before it happened, they would be persecuted for believing in him. And then reading from verse 20 to 24, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. These be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." He is speaking here about the complete dispersal of the nation of Israel, the chosen nation of God. And many people didn't believe him at the time. However, as we know, some 2,000 years later, these events did occur. Jerusalem was surrounded by the Romans in AD 70 after a Jewish rebellion, and it was conquered and destroyed. The Jews were killed, they were enslaved, they were refused entry back into their land by law, and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. So, to recap what we've covered so far, we can see that God chose a people, and he specifically made sure that they knew that they would be his chosen nation, a people set apart, and that he would be their God. Despite persecution and hardship and being overthrown multiple times, they kept their identity and some level of claim to the land that had been promised to them for roughly 2,000 years, until the time that the Romans overthrew them for good and destroyed their holy city and temple and then scattered them. But why were they scattered? Why were they overthrown? Why did they have to endure any of this hardship if God had chosen them to be his nation? Surely if they were chosen, they would also be protected and blessed. Well, God himself explains why right back in the beginning. So if you come back with me to Genesis chapter 17, we can see why. Right back where God told Abraham that he would be the God of Abraham's people, he also established a covenant with them, a contract. If we read from verse 9, "And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep, between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house, or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house, and he that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. The uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant." This covenant stated that anyone who wanted to be a part of this chosen nation, whether they were blood descended from Abraham or if they were brought in from outside the nation, had to be circumcised. This is a physical act of cutting off of flesh. And if they didn't do that, then they were to be cut off from the people, no longer counted as part of that chosen nation of Israel, because they had broken that covenant given to them by their God. So does that mean that every single time the nation was attacked or overthrown or scattered or endured any hardship at all, they had simply forgotten to circumcise their children? Not at all. This circumcision was a physical act, but it represented something much more important. In Deuteronomy 10 verse 16, Moses tells the nation, "Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked." Circumcision, this physical act that the covenant between God and the nation revolved around, was a symbolic act. It represented a removal of sin, a dedication to God, to making sure that he was your God, to doing what he commanded. The people had to remove sin from their hearts, to do what was right and not to stubbornly resist God. And this isn't an isolated idea of circumcising the heart. In the book of Jeremiah, as he prophesies to the people before the Babylonians came and destroyed the first temple and took the nation of Judah into captivity, he tells them to circumcise yourselves to the Lord and take away the foreskins of your heart, ye men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest God's fury come forth like fire and burn that none can quench it because of the evil of your doings. The people were warned to remember their covenant with God, to cut out the evil things in their hearts and in their lives, because otherwise they would be cut out of the nation. And sadly, they didn't listen, time and time again, to these warnings. Before this, when they first took over the land during the time of the judges, before the kings, we're told that the people worshipped and served God during the life of Joshua and all the elders that outlived him. But then in Judges 2, verse 10 to 13, once all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served Balaam. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked the Lord to anger. So God was angry that they forsook him. They began to worship false gods, the gods of these Canaanites that we spoke of earlier. They sacrificed their babies to them and other unspeakable acts. And so God allowed them to lose to the nations around them. And every time they came back to God and repented, they were given a judge, someone who saved them from their enemies. But again, when this judge died, they went back to their old ways, and the cycle continued until the kings came along. Then they were unified, but really the cycle now just happened on sort of a bigger unified scale. With a bad king, the nation as a whole was attacked and pillaged. And under a good king, there was a reformation, and the people served God again, and they were blessed and they were peaceful. Now, the northern kingdom, once they'd split, they never had a good king. So their descent was much quicker, and they were conquered and scattered by the Assyrians, never to truly return to their land. The southern kingdom, however, of Judah had some good kings, but eventually God brought the Babylonians against them and took them into captivity so that they would learn that they needed to trust in God. They needed to follow his ways. And they returned to their land because they eventually listened. They reformed. But once they were back in their land, they fell back to their old ways, and they were conquered and taken over multiple times in the centuries after, up until Christ arrived. At the time, the nation was seemingly at a spiritual high. The influence of the Pharisees and the other religious leading groups was quite high, and they themselves were more pious and seemingly righteous than ever. However, this was far from the case. In Matthew 23, Jesus condemns their ways and attitudes towards the service of God. He says in verses 25 to 28 of Matthew 23, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity." This goes back to the idea of circumcision. It was about circumcising the heart. But the Pharisees here, and by extent the entire nation, as they copied the Pharisees, their religious leaders, they're condemned because they only ever focused on the outside, what people could see. They followed the letter of the law, but they didn't care about people or God. They didn't allow their hearts to be impacted by God's words. They kept the physical acts of the law, but on the inside they were proud, corrupt, and sinful. And this is why Jesus prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, because the nation was once again forsaking God. They were disannulling this covenant made with God, and so he was going to remove them from the land that he had promised, and he was going to give it over to the Gentiles. And as we know from history, the Jews eventually rebelled against the Romans and attempted to set up their own independent state once again. Obviously, the Romans didn't like this, so they sent their armies down. After a brief interval of some Roman civil war to determine who would be the next emperor, after they themselves were sort of rebelling against their own king, they came back to Jerusalem, and then infighting and poor leadership amongst the Jews meant that the Romans took Jerusalem after only 5 months. They killed, enslaved, and displaced most of the population and destroyed the city and the temple. And about 60 years later, after another revolt, they renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palestina to remove any identity that the Jews might try to have with the region. And so that concludes the history timeline of tonight. From start to finish of the ancient nation of Israel, we've seen that there have been good times in their history, there have been bad times, good and bad leaders. Times when they had control over the land that was promised to Abraham, and times when they didn't. And the common thread that we've seen throughout these times is that when the nation was centred around God, with leaders that cared about doing what was right, they were blessed. And then when they forsook God, they floundered and they were persecuted by the nations around them. And that's the final lesson that we wanted to take a look at for the ancient nation of Israel and for us. That we too, if we want to be chosen by God, we also need to listen to him. We need to be joined into that covenant and allow our hearts to be truly, genuinely affected by what he has said and what he wants us to do. Come across with me in conclusion to Psalm 34. Psalm 34 is a song. It's written by David, the second king, the righteous king, but the first truly good king. As we mentioned earlier, he made mistakes, but he always strived to do what was right and allow his heart to be influenced by God. So we'll read Psalm 34 and we'll read from verse 11 through to the end. Come, ye children, hearken unto me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is he that desireth life, and loveth many days, that he may see good? Keep thy tongue from evil, and thy lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil, and do good. Seek peace, and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all their troubles. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. As David says here, God saves those who are righteous, those who do not speak evil, those who do good and seek peace. If you trust in God, you will not be desolate. He will redeem your entire life and redeem you from evil. But if we are evil, like the ancient nation of Israel was at times, God will not be with us. So hopefully tonight we've seen how Israel became a nation chosen by God as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and how throughout their history God was working with them right up until their destruction in AD 70 to bring them back to him, giving them time to fix their ways and act righteously until they outright refused and had to be removed from their land. And also how we too need to make sure we allow our hearts to be positively affected by God and to make sure we follow his commandments and live righteously today. Now, the nation of Israel is still chosen today. This was not just a past thing. But that is the topic of next week's speaker. So I look forward to seeing you all here next week to learn about Israel's present. Thank you.